3 facts that will change your understanding of history. First, Cleopatra was pure Greek. She had not a drop of Egyptian blood in her veins. Second, gladiators were too expensive to die. Most fights ended with a handshake. Third, the Maya civilization did not disappear. They simply relocated and became seafarers. Surprised? These are just 3 out of 30 historical myths that we will debunk. Want to learn the rest? Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out. Comment below which fact shocked you the most. Myth number 1. Rome, the Great Deception, applauded across the forum. Imagine legions stuck in the mud of Gaul, 10 years of relentless war, cold, hunger, and the fury of barbarians. And then, after a bloody, grueling campaign, at the height of glory, Gaius Julius Caesar sends 3 words to the Senate, words that became a symbol of absolute, undeniable victory. Veni, Vidi, Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. For centuries, this phrase has been associated with his greatest triumph, the subjugation of an entire people, the expansion of civilization's borders to the edge of the known world. It echoed like a hymn to Roman genius, like an epitaph on the tomb of Gallic freedom. We see it as the essence of his military talent, lengthy, methodical planning, a decisive strike, and a concise, dignified report. These words are etched in the marble of our imagination as the culmination of a decade of bloodshed, as the final chord of a great symphony of conquest. This is what we were taught, and we believed it because this picture was too grand, too epic to be a lie. It fit perfectly into the image of Caesar, a titan, changing the map of the world with a single gesture. But the dust of ages settled on parchments reveals a story far more prosaic and, at the same time, far more cunning. A story not so much about military valor as about brilliant political manipulation. What if I told you that this legendary phrase, a symbol of the conquest of Gaul, has absolutely nothing to do with Gaul itself? That it was born not in the smoke of years of battles, but during a brief, almost insignificant skirmish inflated to cosmic proportions for one single purpose: to impress Rome? The truth is that Caesar uttered these words after the Battle of Zela in 47 BC. His opponent was not the formidable Vercingetorix, but Pharnaces II, king of Pontus, who sought to reclaim his father's lands by taking advantage of the Roman civil war. The entire campaign, from Caesar's arrival to Pharnaces' complete defeat, took just 5 days. 5 days. This was not a war, it was a police operation. But Caesar, whose reputation in Rome had faltered due to his prolonged rivalry with Pompey, desperately needed a swift, stunning, and unmistakable victory. And he got it. Then he packaged it into 3 catchy words and immediately sent them to the Senate. It was a masterpiece of propaganda. While his opponents were mired in political intrigue, Caesar presented himself as a man of action, solving problems with lightning speed. Came, saw, conquered. This is not a war report, but a slogan crafted to overshadow all rivals and solidify his power. The grand myth of the Gallic victory turned out to be a brilliant public relations move, and Rome, thirsty for heroes, eagerly swallowed the bait. Thus, a quick skirmish in a distant land morphed into a symbol of monumental conquest, demonstrating once again that the art of propaganda is mightier than any sword. While Rome cheered for its hero, the true nature of power and its methods were obscured behind a smokescreen of perfectly chosen words, much like the real story of another great ruler was hidden behind a legend woven through the ages. Myth number 2. Egypt, the Emerald Queen, whose veins held not a drop of Nile blood. Close your eyes and speak her name. Cleopatra. What comes to your mind? The scorching sun of Egypt, the floods of the Nile, golden barges gliding across its waters, the silhouette of a woman with a distinctive profile, her eyes outlined in black, and the authority of pharaohs in every gesture. She embodies Egypt itself, its last great queen, an exotic flower blossoming on the ancient land of pyramids. For centuries, poets, artists, and filmmakers have shaped this image. Cleopatra has become synonymous with the mysteries and allure of Egypt. We envision her as the heir to a millennia-old tradition, the last bearer of the blood of Ramses and Tutankhamun, fighting for her homeland's independence against Roman conquerors. Her tragic story is seen as the swan song of a great civilization, and she herself is regarded as its most vivid embodiment. This legend is so beautiful and so enduring that doubting it feels like sacrilege. It has become a part of our cultural code, an archetype that requires no proof. We believe in it because we want to believe. We desire the last ruler of Egypt to be a true Egyptian, flesh of this land. However, the archives show no sentimentality, and the ink on papyrus tells an entirely different story. A story that does not diminish Cleopatra's greatness, but places it in a far more complex context. The truth, striking in its simplicity, is that Cleopatra VII Philopator was not Egyptian, neither by blood nor by culture. She had not a drop of Egyptian blood in her veins. She was a purebred Greek, a descendant of Ptolemy I Soter, a Macedonian general who seized Egypt 300 years before her birth. The entire Ptolemaic dynasty that ruled the country for 3 centuries was a foreign element. They lived in Alexandria, a Greek city-state on Egyptian soil, spoke Greek, worshipped Greek gods, though they cleverly mixed them with Egyptian ones, and intermarried within their family to preserve the purity of Macedonian blood. They were colonial rulers looking down on their subjects. And here lies Cleopatra's true genius, which the myth completely erases. She was the first and only in her line to do the unthinkable. She learned the Egyptian language. She went so far as to speak to her people in their native dialect. She studied their customs and participated in their religious ceremonies, presenting herself as the embodiment of the goddess Isis. This was not an act of cultural assimilation, but a brilliant political strategy. She understood that to maintain her power, she needed the support of the indigenous population, not just the Greek elite. Although she was not Egyptian by birth, she became one out of calculation, intellect, and political will. Her tragedy is not the demise of the, quote, last Egyptian woman, but the failure of an ambitious project by a Hellenistic ruler trying to save her multinational empire by using ancient symbols to achieve contemporary goals. Myth turned her into an exotic beauty, while the truth reveals a brilliant politician who was 300 years ahead of her time in recognizing that one cannot rule an empire without respecting its roots. And if the image of one queen was so distorted, imagine how misleading our understanding of an entire civilization can be, one that we have come to see as unified and monolithic. Myth number 3. The Maya, a phantom empire that never existed. The jungles of Central America. Through the thick greenery emerged the outlines of giant pyramids. Stone cities connected by sack-bee roads stretch for hundreds of kilometers. In our minds, shaped by popular films and books, the Maya civilization appears as a singular, powerful empire. We imagine something akin to Rome or the Aztec Empire, a central capital, whether it be Tikal or Palenque, from which a powerful emperor, high priest, and god in one person rules over millions of subjects. This image is convenient and clear. It allows us to organize our knowledge and draw parallels with other great powers of antiquity. We say Maya Empire just as easily as we say Roman Empire, implying centralized power, a unified army, and a common political will. For centuries, scholars sought this capital, this Rome of the jungle, trying to understand which city was the main one, from where the commands that shaped the fate of the entire civilization originated. This belief in a unified empire was so strong that it led to the overlooking of obvious contradictions in archaeological findings, different artistic styles, constant wars between neighboring cities, and the absence of a unified pantheon of gods. The myth of a centralized state was too tempting to abandon. However, the deciphering of hieroglyphs in the mid-20th century dealt a crushing blow to this myth, revealing a reality far more complex, dynamic, and brutal beneath the ruins of the majestic empire. The truth is that a unified Maya empire never existed. It was not an empire, but a civilization comprised of a patchwork of hundreds of independent and constantly warring city-states. The political map of the Maya world resembled ancient Greece, with its Athens, Sparta, and Corinth, far more than it resembled a monolithic Egypt. Every city, like Tikal, Calakmul, Copan, or Palenque, had its own ruler, the Holy Lord, who saw himself as the center of the universe and waged endless wars with neighbors for resources, trade routes, and prestige. In the history of the Maya, there was no single capital. There were temporary hegemons. For decades, Tikal dominated. Then, its fierce rival Calakmul took its place, creating powerful military alliances. Then other cities rose to prominence. This was a continuous, bustling political life, filled with intrigue, betrayals, and dynastic marriages. Their incredible achievements in astronomy, mathematics, and art emerged not from unity but in spite of its absence, in a fierce environment of competition. Each ruler aimed to build a pyramid taller than their neighbors, commission a stele with a more boastful inscription, and create a more precise calendar to prove their superiority to the gods and people. This fragmentation contributed to their downfall. As the climate began to change, there was no central authority able to organize a coordinated response to drought and famine. Each city-state fended for itself, which only worsened the chaos. Thus, the myth of a unified empire masked the very essence of Maya civilization, its incredible dynamism and tragic fragility, born out of perpetual rivalry. This was not a civilization of emperors, but of hundreds of kings whose ambitions lifted them to the stars and cast them to dust. Just as the Maya crafted a myth of non-existent unity, another great empire created a myth of its mercy, behind which lay cold steel. Myth number 4. Rome. Mercy as a weapon of mass destruction. The Roman eagle spread its wings over the world. In the shadow of its wings, conquered peoples find law, order, and prosperity. This is the image Rome cultivated for centuries. A key element of this propaganda was the concept of clementia, mercy. Roman historians like Livy and poets like Virgil sang praises of the victor's generosity. They painted a picture in which Rome, having defeated an enemy on the battlefield, does not annihilate them but extends a hand, offering a place within a great civilization. The lives of defeated kings are spared, cities are not erased from the earth, and their inhabitants are granted rights and the opportunity to serve the empire. This myth of Roman mercy was incredibly effective. It framed conquests not as acts of brute aggression, but as a civilizing mission. It justified wars in the eyes of the Romans themselves and created an appealing image for those who were yet to submit. We are still captivated by this idea. It forms the basis of the Western notion of just war and humane treatment of the defeated. We believe Rome was brutal on the battlefield, but wise and forgiving afterward. Because this notion organizes history, giving it a moral dimension, it transforms conquerors into teachers and bloody carnage into a regrettable but necessary step toward the greater good. But if we look beyond the facade of imperial propaganda, we will see that clementia was not so much a virtue as it was a sophisticated tool of control and psychological terror. The truth is that Roman mercy was never unconditional. It was a reward to be earned through complete, unwavering submission. And it always went hand in hand with its terrifying opposite, total destruction. Rome operated on the principle of carrot and stick, taken to the extreme. A city or tribe that fiercely resisted was destined for a horrific fate. Remember Carthage, which was not merely defeated but utterly wiped off the map, the land salted. Recall Corinth, looted and reduced to rubble. Think of Jerusalem, from which not one stone was left standing. These examples were not random bursts of fury. They were calculated actions meant to demonstrate the fate awaiting the defiant. Those who surrendered quickly or betrayed their allies were granted that very mercy. But at what cost? They had to fully renounce their political independence, culture, laws, and identity. Their gods were included in the Roman pantheon as lesser partners. Their elites had to send their children to Rome as hostages, or wards, and their economy began. What did his contemporaries and closest descendants think of him? The answer, hidden in official chronicles and on the walls of other temples, can be shocking. It completely dismantles the image we have created. The truth is that during his lifetime, and for nearly 3,500 years after his death, Tutankhamun was considered an insignificant, fleeting figure. He was merely a boy who ascended the throne at the age of 9 and died before reaching 20. He never won a great battle and did not build a single monumental temple. His only historical achievement, accomplished under the pressure of priests and nobles, was the rejection of his predecessor Akhenaten's religious reforms and the return to the worship of the old gods. For subsequent pharaohs, especially from the 19th dynasty, such as Ramses II, Tutankhamun, and the entire Amarna period, were a disgrace in Egyptian history, a heresy to be erased. His name was systematically removed from official lists of kings. His statues were usurped, and cartouches bearing his name were altered and replaced. He was cursed into oblivion. And it was this oblivion that saved him. His tomb was so insignificant and forgotten so quickly that the builders of Ramses VI's tomb, located higher up the slope, callously buried its entrance with tons of rubble, creating ideal preservation. The robbers who looted almost all the tombs in the Valley of the Kings in ancient times simply did not reach this one. It turned out to be the only nearly untouched royal tomb, not because its pharaoh was great, but because he was no one. His current fame is pure chance, a statistical anomaly, the result of finding his treasures, while the treasures of other, far more powerful pharaohs were looted thousands of years ago. The myth of the great Tutankhamun is a modern invention, a product of media sensationalism. He became great not because of his life, but because of his untouched death. And if the glory of the Egyptian king could be so illusory, what can we say about the power of the Maya kings, whose divinity was a far more fragile gift? Myth number 6. The Maya, divine kings who paid for power with their own blood. In our imagination, a ruler of the ancient world is a figure of absolute authority, an earthly embodiment of deity. We look at Egyptian pharaohs, who were living gods, or Roman emperors, who were deified after death, and we extrapolate this model to other civilizations. When we hear about the sacred lords of the Maya, a similar image emerges in our minds, an all-powerful monarch sitting on a jaguar throne, worshipped by his subjects and ruling by divine right, without doubt or fear. We see him as a recipient of gifts and sacrifices, the pinnacle of a social pyramid that exists to serve him. This image of the god-king is simple, logical, and aligns with our expectations of archaic societies. We believe in it because it reinforces the notion of an insurmountable gulf between rulers and people in ancient times. It seems natural that in a world steeped in religion, a king should be, if not a god, then a representative of one, whose power is sacred and unquestionable. However, the bas-reliefs and codices of the Maya tell a story that turns this concept upside down. The power of Maya kings was not so much a privilege, but a heavy, painful burden, where their divinity required constant validation through physical pain and suffering. The truth is, Maya rulers were not gods on earth in the Egyptian sense. They were intermediaries, mediators whose main and sacred duty was to maintain the cosmic order through personal sacrifices. The Maya believed that the universe needed constant nourishment from sacred energy found in human blood. The most valuable blood was that of the ruler. Therefore, the central event in the life of the Holy Lord was not feasts or conquests, but bloodletting rituals. Using stingray spines, obsidian blades, or thorny ropes, the king and his wife would pierce their tongues, ears, and other parts of their bodies to sprinkle their blood on ritual paper, which was then burned. It was believed that the smoke from this paper opened a portal to the world of gods and ancestors, allowing the ruler to communicate with them and plead for rain, crops, and victory in war. This was not a symbolic act, but a very real and extremely painful procedure, and it was not a right, but a duty. If drought, disease, or military failures struck the land, it meant only one thing: the ruler was doing poorly in his role. His sacrifices were insufficient. The gods were displeased. In such cases, the divine king could be overthrown and sacrificed to appease the higher powers. His authority was not absolute but conditional, based on a contract with the cosmos and his people. He was not so much a god as the main hostage of that cosmos, who had to pay for the well-being of his subjects with his own flesh and blood. The myth depicts a despot reveling in power, while reality presents a tragic figure forced to constantly prove his right to the throne through ritual self-torture. Just as the Maya distorted the image of their ruler, the Romans intentionally demonized their most feared enemy, turning a brilliant strategist into a wild beast. Myth number 7. Rome. Hannibal, the barbarian who read Greek philosophers. Hannibal Barca. Just this name has sent shivers down the spines of Romans for centuries. He is the eternal enemy, the archetypal villain, whose name was used by mothers to scare disobedient children. Hannibal ad portas. Hannibal is at the gates. The Roman historiography, created by the victors, spared no dark paint for his portrait. Titus Livius, Polybius, and others depicted him as a savage, treacherous, bloodthirsty barbarian. He was accused of extreme cruelty, breaking oaths, and showing contempt for gods and men. In their works, he appears as a blind force of destruction, a monster born of the African deserts who hates civilization and seeks only to burn Rome to the ground. This image was incredibly convenient. It transformed the Punic Wars from a clash of two equal Mediterranean powers into an existential battle of civilization against barbarism, order against chaos. The demonization of Hannibal allowed the Romans to justify their own brutality and present their victory as a triumph of light over darkness. And this myth has proven remarkably resilient. To this day, we envision Hannibal as an obsessed fanatic, a brilliant yet savage commander whose sole motivation is the blind hatred instilled by his father during childhood. We picture him leading a ragtag army of mercenaries, contrasting this with the disciplined Roman legions. This portrayal is simple, dramatic, and easy to understand. But it is a gross distortion of reality, a product of the deliberate propaganda war that Rome waged as fiercely as the battles themselves. By examining Greek and Carthaginian sources, as well as reading between the lines of Roman accounts, we find a very different figure. Hannibal was not a savage, but a product of the highly developed Hellenistic culture that permeated Carthage. He was not merely a military leader, but a highly educated man of his time. He spoke and wrote fluently in Greek and Phoenician, studying military history and tactics from Greek authors. His staff during the Italian campaign included Greek historians and philosophers with whom he engaged in discussions. He was a shrewd diplomat, able to forge a coalition of Gallic tribes that had been rivals for centuries. His strategy was based not on blind rage, but on a deep psychological analysis of his opponents. He studied the characters of Roman consuls, predicting their actions and using their ambitions and mistakes against them. Yes, he was ruthless in war, but no more ruthless than any Roman commander of that era. His so-called treachery was often just an unconventional tactical move that baffled the straightforward thinking of the Romans. Rome created the myth of the barbarian Hannibal because acknowledging that their greatest enemy was not a savage, but a man who surpassed many Roman senators in education and strategic thinking, would have been an unbearable humiliation for them. The truth is that the Second Punic War was not a battle of civilization against barbarism, but a tragic clash of two great worlds, where the defeated were deliberately slandered by the victor. And while Rome demonized its enemies, another great civilization was constructing monuments whose true purpose was far more complex and majestic than we usually think. Myth number 8. Egypt, the great lie of the pyramids, which were not simply tombs. Giza Plateau. 3 colossal pyramids towering above the sands, an eternal symbol of ancient Egypt. When asked, "What is this?" any schoolchild would instantly reply, "These are the tombs of the pharaohs." This idea seems self-evident and indisputable. For centuries, Egyptologists, historians, and archaeologists have built their theories based on this single premise. The Great Pyramid of Khufu, or Cheops, is essentially a colossal mausoleum, a monumental tomb built to protect the pharaoh's mummy and treasures from thieves and to ensure his eternal life. Its intricate internal structure, containing corridors, chambers, and false passages, was solely designed for practical burial purposes. Any alternative theories linking it to astronomy, mathematics, or sacred knowledge were dismissed as esotericism and pseudoscience. We buy into this myth because it is simple, materialistic, and fits our perception of the Egyptians as a people obsessed with death and the afterlife. The notion that millions of tons of stone were shifted merely to bury one person, underscores the absolute power of the pharaoh and seems a logical conclusion to this concept. However, as technology progresses and new research methods emerge, this straightforward and convenient theory has started to crack. Beneath it lies a second, far more profound and fascinating layer of meaning, transforming the pyramid from a mere tomb into something immeasurably greater. Indeed, the pyramid served a burial function, no doubt about it, but to reduce it to that is to see only the tip of the iceberg. Modern astrophysical and archaeoacoustic studies reveal that the Great Pyramid was also an incredibly complex, multifunctional instrument. The so-called air shafts leading from the King's Chamber and the Queen's Chamber turned out not to be ventilation shafts at all. They were directed with remarkable precision, down to fractions of a degree, towards specific stars and constellations as they appeared in the sky during the period of its construction. The southern shaft from the King's Chamber pointed to Orion's belt, which represented the god Osiris for the Egyptians, the ruler of the afterlife. The southern shaft from the Queen's Chamber was aimed at Sirius, the star of the goddess Isis, his wife. These shafts were not channels for air, but rather star pathways, symbolic corridors for the pharaoh's soul, allowing it to ascend to the gods and join the eternal cycle of stars. The pyramid was not just a grave, it was a resurrection machine, a giant star tracker that documented key cycles of time and space. Its location, proportions, and internal structure all adhered to a complex cosmological and astronomical scheme. It served as a temple, an observatory, a calendar, and a model of the universe carved in stone. The myth of it being merely a tomb has obscured the true scale of the ancient architects' vision, their profound understanding of astronomy, and their perception of a world where the earthly and the celestial were inseparably linked. And while the Egyptians sought harmony with the cosmos, another great civilization, which we view as an example of ecological wisdom, was in fact waging a war against nature. Myth number 9, the Maya, a green paradise destroyed by its creators. The image of the Maya in popular consciousness is often tinted with idyllic green hues. We envision them as children of nature, living in complete harmony with the surrounding jungles. They built their cities without disrupting the ecosystem. Their agriculture was wise and gentle, and their worldview was deeply rooted in respect for the forest, water, and animals. This myth of the noble savage environmentalist gained popularity in the 20th century, riding the wave of the growing environmental movement. The Maya became a symbol of an alternative path to development, standing in stark contrast to our own industrial civilization, which is destructively consuming the planet. We want to believe in this myth. It gives us hope that harmonious coexistence with nature is possible, that once there was a people who understood the secret of this balance. The image of wise Maya nurturing their, quote, forest gardens and honoring the spirits of the jungle is comforting and romantic. It serves as a silent rebuke to our modern recklessness. However, archaeological data from soil analysis, lake sediment studies, and satellite images paints a very different, much darker, and more instructive picture. The truth is, the Maya were by no means the first ecologists. They were a civilization engaged in a desperate and ultimately lost struggle against nature for resources. Their rapid demographic growth and extensive construction demanded vast amounts of wood and food. But their unique building technology became the jungle's greatest enemy. To create the famous waterproof plaster that covered their temples, palaces, and plazas, they needed enormous quantities of lime. To produce lime, charcoal was required. Estimates show that constructing one average temple required burning trees over hundreds of hectares, and there were thousands of such temples. As a result, for centuries, the Maya practiced catastrophic deforestation around their cities. Satellite images reveal signs of extensive soil erosion caused by the loss of forest cover. Analysis of lake sediments indicates a sharp increase in phosphates, signaling the wash-off of fertile topsoil from fields. This activity altered the local microclimate. Deforestation led to decreased evaporation and, subsequently, reduced rainfall. The Maya, unknowingly, exacerbated droughts which ultimately became one of the main causes of the collapse of their classical civilization. Their decline was not merely the result of external factors, but the consequence of a prolonged environmental crisis triggered by their own actions. The myth of harmony with nature obscures the tragic story of a civilization that fell victim to its own success and depleted its environmental resources long before the arrival of Europeans. This is a far more important and alarming lesson than a romantic tale. Just as the Maya did not invent harmony with nature, the Romans did not invent one of the key elements of their architecture that became a symbol of their engineering genius. Myth number 10. Rome, an arch built by foreign hands. Aqueducts, bridges, amphitheaters, triumphal arches. When we think about Roman architecture, the first thing that comes to mind is the majestic and sturdy arch. It has become a hallmark of Roman engineering, symbolizing their ability to span vast spaces, build to last for centuries, and shape the landscape. We often consider the arch, the vault, and the dome to be purely Roman inventions. Textbooks and popular literature tell us how brilliant Roman engineers, moving away from the primitive Greek post and lintel system, discovered the principle of the keystone arch, which revolutionized construction. This myth flatters our Eurocentric view of history. It creates a neat narrative of progress. The Greeks established aesthetics, while the practical Romans provided engineering solutions that laid the foundation for all subsequent European architecture. The belief that it was Rome that gifted the world the arch is so strong that it seems almost unshakable. We look at the Colosseum and see it as a triumph of Roman thought. Yet, the history of technology is rarely a story of a single, brilliant insight. More often, it is a tale of borrowing, improvement, and most importantly, mass implementation. And the history of the arch is a perfect illustration of this. The truth is that the Romans did not invent the arch. They were brilliant popularizers, engineers, and logisticians, but not original creators. The very concept of a true keystone arch was borrowed from their neighbors and predecessors on the Italian peninsula, the mysterious Etruscans. The Etruscans were the first in Italy to actively utilize arches in the construction of city gates and tombs several centuries before the rise of Rome. However, even the Etruscans were not the inventors of the arch. Archaeological findings show that the arch as an architectural element was known long before them. The earliest examples of true arch constructions were discovered in Mesopotamia, dating back to the 2nd millennium before Christ. The ancient Egyptians also knew of and used arches, although not so widely, mainly in utility and underground structures. So, where does the genius of the Romans lie? It was not in invention, but in recognizing the full potential of this structure and standardizing it. The Romans were the first to understand that an arch was not just a way to span an opening, but a universal building module. They combined the arch with another great invention, this time truly their own: concrete. The combination of arch construction and inexpensive, durable concrete allowed them to build quickly, in large quantities, and on an unprecedented scale. They transformed an elite and rare technology into a foundation for mass construction. Their aqueducts, consisting of thousands of identical arches, are a triumph not just of ingenuity, but of organization, logistics, and standardization. The myth of the Roman invention of the arch obscures a more complex and interesting truth. Progress often moves not through lone geniuses, but through civilizations capable of recognizing, improving, and widely implementing the ideas of others. Rome was not just an inventor, but the greatest system integrator in history. As we discuss engineering misconceptions, let's take a trip back to Egypt, where one of the most famous fallacies concerns not stone, but human flesh. Myth number 11. Egypt, the brain thrown away in the trash of history. The mummification process in ancient Egypt is surrounded by numerous myths and legends, but one fact is repeated in almost every account. The Egyptians considered the brain to be an entirely useless organ. During the embalming process, priests would use a special hook to extract the brain through the nostrils and simply discard it, while carefully preserving the heart, liver, lungs, and other organs in special canopic jars. This image is striking and persuasive. It paints a picture of a civilization that reached astonishing heights in architecture and art, yet remained remarkably ignorant when it came to anatomy. The idea that the center of thought and consciousness was seen as mere excess underlines their mystical rather than scientific worldview. They believed the heart housed the soul and intellect, weighing it during the judgment of Osiris, while the brain played no role in this belief system at all. This myth has firmly entered textbooks and documentaries. It is simple, clear, and creates a needed contrast between the spiritual Egypt and rational Greece, where modern medicine was born. We believe in this narrative because it reinforces our sense of progress and superiority of contemporary science over ancient superstitions. However, as is often the case, the truth is far more complex and nuanced than this crude stereotype. Indeed, in the classical mummification procedure, the brain was removed and not preserved, but this was not due to its, quote, uselessness. Rather, it was for practical reasons. The brain decomposes very quickly and could damage the rest of the body. To claim that the Egyptians knew nothing about its functions is to overlook one of the most extraordinary medical documents of antiquity. This document, known as the Edwin Smith Papyrus, is dated around 1,600 years before Christ, but it is a copy of an even older text. It is not a collection of magical spells, but a strictly practical guide for a military surgeon, detailing 48 cases of injuries from head to toe. And it is within this papyrus that we find the first description of the human brain in recorded history. The author describes its surface as folds like melted copper, which is an astonishingly accurate comparison to the brain's convolutions. He describes cranial sutures and meninges. Most importantly, Egyptian doctors were the first in history to establish a connection between injury to a specific part of the brain and paralysis in the opposite side of the body. They understood that head trauma could affect speech and movement. They conducted a clear correlation between the physical state of the brain and bodily functions. This was a revolutionary discovery that preceded Greek medicine by 1,000 years. So why didn't this knowledge change the practice of removing the brain during mummification? It is likely because religious traditions and burial rituals were extremely conservative and changed much more slowly than practical medical knowledge. Battlefield surgeons already understood the importance of the brain, but embalmers continued to follow rituals set centuries earlier. The myth of the useless brain hides from us a fascinating story of how scientific knowledge and religious dogma could coexist within a single culture without blending. The Egyptians were not uneducated. They were pragmatists who had different explanations for different aspects of life. While they sought to unravel the mysteries of the body, the Maya used their calendars for purposes far more complex than simply counting days. Myth number 12. The Maya, a calendar that predicts human destinies, not the end of the world. The Maya calendar. For most people, this phrase brings to mind two things: incredible accuracy and the prediction of the world's end in 2012. The myth of a prophetic calendar counting down to a global apocalypse became one of the most prominent cultural phenomena of the early 21st century. We envision ancient priests studying the stars and creating a complex system solely to calculate the final date for the world's existence. This idea captivates the imagination. It paints the Maya as mystical seers with sacred knowledge about humanity's fate. In this interpretation, the calendar is not merely a tool for measuring time, but a ticking mechanism of cosmic clocks leading to an inevitable conclusion. Belief in this myth was fueled by mass culture, films, and pseudoscientific theories. However, the truth behind this myth is far more interesting and complex. Firstly, the Maya had not just one, but a whole system of interconnected calendars. There was the Zolkin, a ritual 260-day cycle, and the Hab, a civil 365-day solar calendar. But the most important was the so-called long count, which became the source of the apocalypse myth. It was a linear calendar that counted days from a mythical starting point, around 3114 BCE. 2012 was simply the end date of one significant cycle of this calendar, lasting approximately 5,125 years. For the Maya, this was not the end of the world, but just a transition to a new cycle, much like how we shift from December 31st to January 1st. But the most significant misconception revolves around why this complex system was created. The long count was not a tool for predicting apocalypse. It was a sophisticated instrument for forecasting social and historical cycles. The Maya believed that history was not linear, but fractal and cyclical. They thought that events separated by certain time intervals had a tendency to repeat. Their priests and mathematicians were not so much mystics as they were the world's first social analysts. They meticulously recorded all significant events, ascensions to the throne, wars, droughts, and epidemics. Then, using their calendar, they searched for patterns. They calculated when similar events occurred in the past and tried to predict when wars, famines, or dynastic crises might repeat based on that. This was an attempt to bring order to the chaos of human history, to find rhythm and structure within it. For a Maya ruler, the calendar was an essential political tool. It allowed them to predict the future, or rather, extrapolate from the past, and make decisions, like whether to start a war, form an alliance, or stockpile food. In this way, the myth of the apocalypse calendar obscured the true genius of the Maya. Their effort to create a mathematical model of history based on the idea of its cyclicity. They looked to the past not out of idle curiosity, but to forecast the future of their society. And while we discuss how we perceive the past, it's worth remembering that our image of the ancient world is also one big myth, shaped by time. Myth number 13. Rome, a dazzling array of colors in a world we perceive as white. Antiquity. In our imagination, it appears in noble, subdued tones. We envision white marble temples, their columns proudly reaching toward the blue sky. We imagine statues of gods and emperors crafted from dazzling white Carrara or Parian marble, whose purity and flawless forms seem a hallmark of classical beauty. This image of white antiquity was created during the Renaissance and solidified in the 18th century by neoclassical aesthetics. When the first systematic excavations in Pompeii and Herculaneum revealed ancient sculptures to the world, they were indeed like that, white, stripped of color from centuries of being buried in the ground. Scholars and artists of that time, like Johann Winckelmann, proclaimed this whiteness as the ideal, a symbol of purity, rationality, and harmony, contrasting it with the, quote, barbaric brightness of medieval art. This myth proved remarkably resilient. It shaped our museum exhibitions, architectural styles, and even Hollywood films about ancient Rome. We believe in the whiteness of antiquity because it has become part of our aesthetic code. It seems to us that bright colors would tarnish the solemn grandeur of the Parthenon or the Forum. This idea is so deeply ingrained that the truth feels almost shocking, tasteless, and even offensive to our sense of beauty. The truth is that ancient Rome, like ancient Greece, was not white, but dazzlingly, shockingly bright. Our modern notions of restraint and good taste would be completely foreign to them. Using ultraviolet and infrared spectroscopy, along with analyzing microscopic traces of pigments on the surfaces of statues and buildings, scientists have been able to reconstruct their original appearance, and the picture is astonishing. Statues of gods and emperors were painted in the most vivid colors, imitating skin, hair, eye, and clothing tones. The marble Aphrodite could have had light hair, blue eyes, and worn a bright red dress with a gilded trim. The bronze armor on the statue of Augustus from Prima Porta would have been polished to a shine, and his tunic would have been purple. Temples and public buildings were also richly colored. Friezes, column capitals, and reliefs were painted in vibrant blues, reds, greens, and yellows with abundant use of gold leaf. The Roman Forum at its peak was not noble white, but more like a gigantic, colorful, theatrical backdrop. The white marble we cherish today was just a canvas for them, a base for color. Our myth of white antiquity is a product of misunderstanding, born from a time that washed away the pigments and the aesthetic preferences of later eras that elevated this flaw into a virtue. True Rome was a world of bright, almost garish colors, full of life and energy, not the sterile and cold image we have imagined. Just as we misunderstood the appearance of an entire world, we also misconceived the purpose of one of its most famous monuments. Myth number 14. Egypt, the Sphinx that looked not at the pyramids, but at the stars. The Great Sphinx of Giza, a gigantic figure with the body of a lion and the face of a human, lying in the sands. For thousands of years, it has sparked the imagination. Who built it? Whom does it represent? And most importantly, why? The most widespread and entrenched myth holds that the Sphinx is the guardian of the pyramids. It was placed here to protect the resting place of pharaohs buried in great tombs from evil spirits and thieves. This idea seems logical and intuitive. We see three pyramids and at their base, a colossal guardian. Its position seems to suggest this function. In popular culture, the Sphinx is often depicted as a mysterious sentry, posing riddles to travelers, a portrayal borrowed from the Greek myth of Oedipus, but with no connection to Egyptian beliefs. We believe in the myth of the guardian Sphinx because it's simple and functional. It provides a clear explanation for the existence of this grand monument, turning it into part of a funerary complex. However, ancient texts and archaeological evidence indicate that its role was far more complex and active than mere passive guarding. The Sphinx was not just a sentinel, but a central element of a grand solar and stellar mechanism. The truth is that during the era of the Old Kingdom, when it was built, the Sphinx was not seen as a guardian. Its ancient Egyptian name was Horus on the horizon, directly linking it to the sky god Horus and the sun. The Sphinx looks sternly to the east, toward the point on the horizon where the sun rises on the days of the spring and autumn equinoxes. On these days, the sun rises precisely between its paws. Thus, the Sphinx and the temple situated directly in front of it served as a colossal equatorial marker, fixed on key points of the annual solar cycle. He was not merely the guardian of the necropolis, but an active participant in solar rituals, the heart of a vast open-air temple complex dedicated to the sun cult. Moreover, some researchers suggest his possible connection to the stars. During the era of his construction, around 2,500 years before our era, on the day of the spring equinox, the constellation Taurus rose in the east alongside the sun, while the constellation Leo, associated with the body of the Sphinx, was at its zenith. Thus, he could also be an earthly embodiment of this constellation, marking a specific astronomical epoch. The myth of the guardian of the pyramids reduces his role to a primitive protective function, concealing his true purpose, to be a reference point for time and space, a sacred instrument that connected the pharaoh, the sun, and the stars in a unified cosmological drama. While the Sphinx served to signify life, the sacred wells of another civilization, which we consider only as places of death, were in fact sources of everything. Myth number 15. The Mayans, cenotes, which were not altars of death, but gateways to life. The sacred cenotes of Yucatan, deep natural wells filled with turquoise water, piercing the limestone slab of the peninsula. In the collective consciousness, they are firmly associated with one thing: human sacrifice. Legends, fueled by the tales of Spanish conquistadors and romantic archaeologists of the 19th century, paint a grim picture. Priests in ornate regalia casting young girls and captive warriors into dark waters to appease the bloodthirsty rain god Chak. This image of wells of death has become the hallmark of Mayan religious practices. It is dramatic, brutal, and easy to remember. We believe in it because it fits our stereotypical view of savage, pre-Columbian civilizations with their bloody rituals. Stories about gold and turtles found at the bottom of the sacred cenote in Chichen Itza seem to confirm this version beyond doubt. But by focusing solely on this bloody aspect, we overlook the main, fundamental role that cenotes played in the lives of the Mayans. We see only an altar, but fail to recognize the source. The truth is that cenotes were primarily sources of life, not death. On the arid limestone plateau of Yucatan, where there are hardly any rivers or lakes, these natural wells were the only source of fresh water year-round. All Mayan cities in this region were built around cenotes. They were the centers of settlements, the foundation of the economy, and a condition for survival. Without them, civilization here would simply have been impossible. In terms of Mayan religion, cenotes were not just water bodies, they were considered xibalbabe, roads to Xibalba, the underworld, home to gods and ancestors. These were sacred portals connecting the world of humans with the supernatural realm. Therefore, they became sites for offerings. The Mayans cast precious items into them: jade, ceramics, gold, not as trash, but as gifts to the deities dwelling in the lower world. Yes, human sacrifices did occur there, and archaeology confirms this. However, they were neither mass nor daily events. These were extraordinary acts performed during severe crises, such as prolonged droughts. It wasn't merely about killing, it was a ritual nourishing of the land and the rain god, an attempt to repay the debt for the given water and life. The myth of cenotes as execution sites is a gross simplification, ignoring their central role as sources of water and sacred centers of the Maya universe. It's akin to describing a Christian cathedral while only mentioning the crypts in its basement. The reality was that cenotes meant everything to the Maya: a water source, a gateway to the world of gods, and, only in the most extreme cases, a place for the greatest sacrifices. And while we're discussing sacrifices, let's turn our attention to Rome, where the world's most famous arena has also been surrounded by myths of religious executions. Myth number 16. Rome, the Colosseum and the silence of lions that didn't eat Christians. The Colosseum, the grand Flavian amphitheater, a symbol of the eternal city. In our minds, it's tightly interwoven with the image of martyrs. We envision an arena soaked in blood, where unarmed Christians, men, women, and children, are tossed to hungry lions amid the roaring of a frenzied crowd. This image has become one of the most powerful symbols of early Christianity, a story of faith's resilience in the face of pagan cruelty. It's captured in thousands of paintings, books, and films. Stories of St. Ignatius, torn apart by lions, or hundreds of nameless martyrs perishing in the arena's sand, have become part of Christian tradition. We believe in this myth because it carries immense emotional weight. It creates a clear divide between good and evil, innocent victims and ruthless executioners. In this narrative, the Colosseum becomes a gateway to paradise for the martyrs and a symbol of the moral decay of the Roman Empire. It serves as a cautionary tale about how faith can triumph over even the mightiest tyranny. But if we turn to historical documents with the cold eye of an investigator rather than the reverent gaze of a believer, we encounter a startling fact. Despite the popularity of this myth, we have no reliable historical evidence, neither Christian nor pagan, that directly claims Christians were executed in the Colosseum specifically for their faith. Yes, there were persecutions against Christians in the Roman Empire. However, these were sporadic rather than systematic, primarily driven by political, not purely religious motives. Christians were not accused for believing in Christ, but for refusing to participate in the imperial cult, which was viewed as treason. Executions certainly occurred. Christians were crucified, burned, and fed to wild beasts. But where did this take place? Mostly in circuses, like Nero's circus on Vatican Hill, where, according to tradition, Apostle Peter was crucified, or in arenas in the provinces, where local persecutions flared up. The Colosseum was the main entertainment hub of Rome, a venue for gladiatorial battles and grand spectacles. Executions of criminals did occur there, but these were regular offenders, not political prisoners, which is how Christians were viewed. The image of Christians in the Colosseum's lion's den is a later construct created by Christian authors after the fall of the empire, designed to enhance the drama of martyr stories and transform a specific arena into a symbol of all persecutions. It's a powerful symbol, but not a historical fact. The truth is that the real suffering of early Christians was scattered throughout the empire and did not need to be tied to one particular building, no matter how famous it was. The myth of the Colosseum as the main site of Christian executions exemplifies how the memory of real tragedy crystallizes over time around one vivid yet likely fictional image. While the Romans may not have been as bloodthirsty towards non-believers, the Egyptians over time exhibited remarkable humanity in their burial practices. Myth number 17. Egypt, Ushabti, the dolls that saved thousands of lives. The afterlife of ancient Egypt. We imagine it as a perfect replica of the earthly world, where the pharaoh continues to rule and his servants continue to serve. From this concept emerges one of the most chilling myths associated with Egyptian funerals, the myth of human sacrifices. It is believed that when a pharaoh or high noble died, his servants, wives, warriors, and slaves were killed and buried with him so they could continue to serve their master in the next world. This image of a wild and ruthless ritual has firmly settled in our consciousness. It paints a picture of a society where the life of a common person was worth nothing compared to the afterlife comfort of the ruler. This idea seems quite logical for a despotic civilization of the Bronze Age. We look at other cultures where such practices truly existed, for example, in ancient China or among the Scythians, and easily apply this model to Egypt. Stories of hundreds of servants sealed in tombs stir the imagination and underscore the limitless power of pharaohs. This myth fits so well into the overarching narrative of brutal antiquity that we accept it without much evidence. However, if we turn to archaeology, we find that this barbaric custom was not the rule, but rather a short and long-forgotten episode in Egypt's 3,000-year history. The truth is that ritual killings of servants to accompany their master into the afterlife were practiced in Egypt, but only in very early times, during the First Dynasty, around 3,000 years before our era. There indeed exist tombs of early kings in the necropolis at Abydos, surrounded by hundreds of graves of courtiers who apparently were sacrificed during the funerals. But by the time of the Second Dynasty, just a couple of centuries later, this practice had completely ceased. In its place emerged one of the most humane and clever inventions in the history of religion, the Ushabti figures. The Egyptians seemingly quickly realized that killing healthy and able-bodied people was not only cruel, but also highly impractical for the state's economy. A living servant working the fields or building temples would bring far more benefit to the country than a dead one lying in a tomb. They found a brilliant solution. They began placing small statues in tombs, depicting workers with hoes and baskets. These figures were called Ushabti, which means answerers. Special spells from the Book of the Dead were inscribed on them, meant to bring them to life in the afterlife. When the god summoned the deceased to work in the fields of Ialu, the Egyptian paradise, he was to present one of these figures as a substitute and say, "This is me." The Ushabti would then respond and go work on behalf of its owner. Over time, the number of Ushabti in tombs grew. Wealthy individuals could have up to 400 of them, one for each day of the year and one for each foreman. The myth of constant human sacrifices conceals an astonishing story of how the Egyptians carried out a humanitarian revolution by replacing real violence with a magical symbol. They found a way to reconcile their religious beliefs with practical necessity and common sense, demonstrating a flexibility of thought that many later civilizations could only envy. And turning to everyday life, our perceptions of the Maya also contain many misconceptions, especially regarding their food. Myth number 18, the Maya, forgotten gardens that fed the cities. Corn, or maize. It was the foundation of life for all Mesoamerican civilizations, and the Maya were no exception. In our minds, their diet is firmly linked to this grain. We envision endless fields of corn scorched in the jungles, and farmers whose diets consisted solely of tortillas, atole porridge, and nothing more. This image of a corn civilization is simple and clear. It emphasizes the Maya's dependence on a single crop and, according to many, explains their vulnerability to droughts. If the corn harvest failed, famine threatened the cities. This myth is rooted in truth. Corn was indeed a sacred and staple food, but it significantly simplifies and impoverishes our understanding of Maya agriculture and cuisine. It portrays them as primitive farmers, unaware of diversity, making their diet appear dull and monotonous. However, paleobotanical research, analysis of food residues on ancient pottery, and the study of contemporary practices among indigenous peoples who preserved ancient knowledge reveal a world of gastronomic abundance we never suspected. The truth is that the Maya diet was incredibly rich and diverse, and their agricultural system was remarkably complex and sustainable. Yes, they did grow corn, but that was just part of a much more intricate system. The Maya were masters of agroforestry. They didn't simply clear jungles, they created what are known as forest gardens, multi-layered ecosystems where dozens of useful plants coexisted on a single plot of land. Next to corn, beans, and squash, the famous Three Sisters, they also grew tomatoes, chili peppers, avocados, papayas, cocoa beans, vanilla, sweet potatoes, and cassava. They cultivated dozens of types of fruit trees, nuts, and medicinal herbs. This system was much more resilient to droughts than a single crop field. If the corn failed, root crops and fruits would still remain. But that's not all. The Maya were not only farmers but also livestock keepers. They domesticated turkeys for meat and eggs. They kept stingless bees for honey production. And, surprisingly, they raised edible dogs, a specific breed that was fattened for food. Additionally, hunting, for deer, peccaries, and monkeys, and fishing played significant roles in their diet. Their meals were rich in proteins, vitamins, and trace elements, and, evidently, were much more balanced and nutritious than that of the average European peasant of the same period, who primarily relied on bread and turnips. The myth of the exclusive corn diet masks a complex and wise food production system that allowed the Maya to sustain a high population density in the tropical forest for centuries. And speaking of misconceptions about everyday life, perhaps no topic has spawned as many myths as gladiatorial combat in Rome. Myth number 19. In Rome, gladiators left the arena alive more often than they died. A Roman gladiator. A warrior slave stepping into the arena to die for the amusement of the crowd. His motto, addressed to the emperor, was, Ave Caesar, morituri te salutant. Hail Caesar, those who are about to die salute you. Every fight was a battle not for life but for death. The loser was doomed. The winner lived only until the next match. This image of a bloody and ruthless spectacle where human life was worth nothing has firmly taken root in our minds thanks to Hollywood films and popular literature. We imagine the Colosseum as a conveyor of death where dozens and hundreds of people died. For years, fighters were trained by the best coaches, provided with specialized diets and the finest medical care available at the time. Losing such an athlete in the very first fight would have been a financial disaster for the Lenistas. Therefore, most battles did not end in death. There were strict rules and referees to ensure they were followed. Most fights continued until one of the gladiators was wounded or exhausted and acknowledged defeat by raising his index finger. After that, his fate was determined by the editor, the organizer of the games, often the emperor himself, who listened to the crowd's opinion. In most cases, the loser was granted a reprieve, missio. The death sentence, pollice verso, the famous thumbs down, although its exact meaning is still debated, was the exception rather than the rule, applied to those who fought cowardly or ineffectively. Statistical data obtained from analyzing gladiator gravestones show that the average age of death was around 27, and many managed to participate in dozens of fights. Modern historians estimate the mortality rate in a single duel to be around 10 to 20%, comparable to the risk level in some contemporary extreme sports. The myth of fights to the death obscures the truth that gladiatorial games were primarily a professional sport and business, rather than just a bloody massacre. A gladiator was a costly investment that individuals sought to protect. As for the phrase morituri te salutant, it appears in sources only once, and it was not uttered by gladiators but by criminals condemned to death who were forced to participate in a staged naval battle. It wasn't a standard formula, but rather a cry of despair from the doomed. And since we are discussing life and death, it is worth reconsidering the fundamental misconception surrounding civilization, which we deem obsessed with death. Myth number 20. Egypt, a civilization so enamored with life that it did not wish to part with it. Ancient Egypt. In popular consciousness, it is inextricably linked to the cult of death. Pyramids, tombs, mummies, the Book of the Dead, gods with animal heads reigning in the afterlife. All this creates an image of a grim, mysterious civilization whose thoughts and aspirations were entirely focused on preparing for an afterlife. We envision the Egyptians as a people who despised earthly life, viewing it as a mere brief and insignificant prelude to eternity. Their colossal efforts in building tombs and developing intricate burial rituals seem to irrefutably prove this obsession with death. This myth is quite convenient. It exoticizes Egypt, making it distinct from other cultures and explaining its unique characteristics. We believe in it because it offers a simple, all-encompassing formula. Egypt is a civilization of death. This formula allows us to easily classify and understand this ancient world without delving into the complexities of its intricate worldview. However, if we take a closer look at their texts, examine the inscriptions on the walls of their tombs, and try to understand the logic behind their rituals, we will find that this myth is a complete inversion, a turning upside down of the truth. The reality is that the Egyptians were not obsessed with death, but rather desperately in love with life. Their elaborate burial culture did not arise from a disdain for the earthly realm, but from a panicked fear of losing it. They cherished their lives, the sun, the Nile, family, beer, bread, festivals, so much that their main goal was to ensure that this life never ended. For them, death was not a passage to a better world, but a terrible catastrophe, an interruption of existence that needed to be overcome at any cost. All their rituals, from mummification to magical spells, were not meant to glorify death, but to deny it and to combat it. Mummification was not intended for the body to rest in peace, but to preserve it as a physical shell for the soul, Ka and Ba, so it could continue to enjoy life. Tombs were not simply graves, but houses of eternity, exact replicas of earthly homes filled with everything necessary for a comfortable existence: food, furniture, clothing, games. The wall paintings in the tombs depict not scenes of death and suffering, but idealized images of earthly life: harvests, hunting, feasts, family celebrations. The deceased wanted these scenes to surround them forever, desiring their afterlife to be a perfect copy of earthly life, only devoid of illness, old age, and suffering. The Book of the Dead is not a tribute to death, but a collection of instructions and spells designed to help the deceased navigate the dangers of the afterlife and successfully be reborn into a new eternal life. The myth of obsession with death hides the profound life-affirming spirit of the Egyptian civilization. It was a culture that said no to oblivion and made titanic efforts to extend the joy of existence into eternity. And while the Egyptians strove to preserve their familiar world, the Maya were creating clothing that was far more complex and multifunctional than we tend to think. Myth number 21. The Maya wore clothing, which served as passport and map. The clothing of the ancient Maya often appears in our imagination in its simplest and most primitive form: men in loincloths, women in plain white dresses or skirts. This image, partly shaped by early, not always accurate sketches from European explorers, paints a picture of modest and unassuming living. We look at stone reliefs, where the details of clothing have worn away over time, and conclude that textile art among the Maya was not very advanced. This myth is convenient because it fits into the broader narrative of children of the jungle, who do not need elaborate clothing in the hot climate. We compare their simplicity to the grandeur of the Aztecs or Incas, and this image seems logical to us. But the tropical climate destroyed nearly all organic materials, and what we see in stone is merely a pale shadow of reality. Fortunately, detailed images on ceramics and weaving traditions have survived that still endure among the descendants of the Maya. They share a story about textiles that were not merely clothing, but true works of art and complex systems of symbolism. The truth is that Maya textiles were the pinnacle of their craftsmanship and played a colossal role in their society. Weaving was a sacred pursuit, overseen by the moon goddess Ixchel. Maya women were master weavers, creating fabrics of incredible complexity and beauty. They used cotton, agave fibers, and other plant materials, mastering dozens of techniques in weaving, embroidery, and dyeing. Their palette was astonishingly rich. They extracted dyes from plants, insects such as cochineal for producing crimson, and even from marine mollusks. The most prestigious color, purple, was derived from rare sea snails, and clothing of this hue cost a fortune. But most importantly, clothing was not just a decoration, it was a passport, a social marker, and a statement of identity. By the intricate geometric patterns, colors, and embroidered symbols, one could instantly determine a person's social status, profession, marital status, and, most crucially, their hometown or community. Each city-state had its unique style in clothing, with its own set of patterns and symbols. Clothing was a visual language that helped the Maya navigate their complex, fragmented world. For the elite, attire also served as a demonstration of power. Their outfits were adorned with embroidery made from the feathers of the sacred quetzal bird, jade ornaments, and shells. Textiles were among the primary items of trade, tribute, and diplomatic gifts. Losing a feathered headdress in battle was akin to losing a banner. The myth of simple loincloths obscures an entire world of high art and intricate social semiotics. It diminishes our understanding of a culture for which fabric was as vital as language and writing are to us. And when we discuss how entire aspects of culture have been underestimated, we must also remember how unfairly history has treated one of the most influential women of Rome. Myth number 22. Rome. Agrippina, the Empress, slurred by men. Agrippina the Younger. In history, she is remembered as a monster in feminine form. The sister of Caligula, the wife of Claudius, and the mother of Nero. Her name became synonymous with ruthless ambition, political intrigue, poisonings, and incest. Male historians like Tacitus and Suetonius created her canonized image, a power-hungry woman who used her beauty and cunning, first to make her uncle husband Claudius emperor, and then poisoned him to place her son Nero on the throne. And when her son spiraled out of control, she paid the price, becoming his victim. This portrayal is extremely dramatic and instructive. He perfectly fits into the traditional Roman patriarchal moral framework, which viewed any woman daring to intervene in high politics with suspicion and hatred. The story of Agrippina serves as a warning, an example of the chaos and depravity that women in power can lead to. We believe in this myth because it has been recounted by brilliant writers and repeated for 2,000 years. It is simple, clear, and reinforces the age-old stereotype of the cunning and dangerous woman seeking power. However, if we set aside the misogynistic rhetoric of ancient authors and examine the facts they present, we can see beyond the caricature of a monster to find the figure of an outstanding stateswoman, perhaps one of the most effective administrators of her time. The truth is that Agrippina was not merely an ambitious mother. In the early years of Nero's reign, while he was still young, she was de facto co-ruler and regent of the empire. This was a time that later historians, despite their animosity towards her, dubbed one of the most stable and prosperous periods of the early empire. Following the chaotic and unpredictable reign of Claudius, Agrippina, relying on loyal advisors like Seneca and Burrus, implemented a series of crucial reforms. She brought order to the imperial finances, which had been thrown into disarray by the extravagance of her predecessors. She stabilized the administrative apparatus by appointing competent individuals to key positions rather than the emperor's favorites. She managed foreign policy, receiving ambassadors and overseeing border situations. She was the first woman whose name appeared on coins alongside that of the ruling emperor, sharing equal prominence. Her crime was not incompetence, rather it was her competence and her refusal to hide her power. She challenged the entire Roman system, where politics was exclusively a male domain. Historians from the senatorial aristocracy, who despised strong imperial authority, and even more so, a strong woman in power, could not forgive her for this. They intentionally tarnished her legacy, attributing to her every imaginable vice, and reducing her achievements to mere bedroom intrigues and poisonings. The myth of Agrippina the Monster is a classic example of how history, written by men, can ruin the reputation of a remarkable woman, transforming her from an effective ruler into a caricature of a villain. While women in Rome had to fight for every right, their status in Egypt was surprisingly more liberated. Myth number 23. Egypt. Women who could divorce and own everything. The ancient world. For us, it is synonymous with total patriarchy. We picture a society where women were completely powerless, regarded as property first of their fathers and later of their husbands. Their world was confined to the home and family. They had no voice, were unable to own property, and their legal status was akin to that of a child or a slave. This depiction, generally accurate for many ancient civilizations such as Greece or Rome, especially in their early periods, is often applied to ancient Egypt as well. We look at images of pharaohs and male gods and conclude that Egyptian society was as strictly hierarchical and misogynistic as the others. This myth seems logical and self-evident. It fits into the broader narrative of historical progress, suggesting that women's rights are a modern achievement. We believe in it because it reinforces our faith that we live in the best and most just era. However, marriage contracts, legal documents, and private letters that have survived from Egypt paint a strikingly different, nearly revolutionary picture of social structure for its time. The truth is that Egyptian women, regardless of their social status, possessed a legal and economic right set that their European sisters would not gain until the late 19th or even the 20th century. Egyptian law regarded women as fully capable individuals. Women had the right to own and manage property, whether inherited or acquired. They could buy and sell land, houses, and slaves. They could enter into contracts in their own name without needing permission or guardianship from their husbands, fathers, or brothers. They could appear in court as plaintiffs, defendants, or witnesses, and most remarkably, they had the right to divorce. A woman could initiate a divorce of her own accord, and in such cases, the marriage contract guaranteed her the return of her dowry, as well as 1/3 of the jointly acquired marital property. This provided her with economic independence and protection against her husband's whims. Of course, Egyptian society was not egalitarian in the modern sense. Most high governmental and priestly positions were held by men. However, in the realm of civil law and economic activity, Egyptian women enjoyed remarkable freedom. They could be anyone from farmers to priestesses, from artisans to owners of large enterprises. This unique status of women was likely connected to the characteristics of Egyptian mythology, where goddesses like Isis and Hathor played essential roles, as well as to the inheritance system, where property was often passed down through the female line. The myth of powerless Egyptian women obscures the existence of a unique legal oasis in the ancient world, where women were seen not as property but as individuals. And while we are discussing the unique traits of civilizations, it is worth dispelling another myth regarding the history of the Maya and their singular golden age. Myth number 24. The Maya, forgotten metropolises that predated Rome. The classic period of Maya civilization, roughly from 250 to 900 CE. It was during this time, as we are told, that the most famous cities, Tikal, Palenque, Copan, were constructed. It was then that the tallest pyramids were built, the most exquisite artworks were created, and the peak of scientific knowledge was reached. After that, a mysterious collapse occurred. The cities in the southern jungles were abandoned and civilization waned, only partially reviving later in the north of Yucatan. This pattern of one rise, one fall is convenient to present in textbooks. It creates a simple and clear narrative arc: birth, flourishing, demise. We tend to view the classical period as the only peak of Maya development, while everything before it, the pre-classical period, is seen as a modest prelude, a time of small villages and primitive temples. This myth is deeply entrenched in both science and the public consciousness. It focuses our attention on a specific time frame and a certain set of archaeological sites, relegating everything else to the background. But recent discoveries made with LiDAR, laser scanners capable of seeing through jungles, have revolutionized our understanding. They revealed that the history of the Maya was not a single mountain, but rather a whole mountain range with many peaks. The truth is, the so-called pre-classical period was a time of vast city-states that, by size and grandeur, not only matched but surpassed the famous cities of the classical era. In the heart of the Guatemalan jungles, in the Mirador Basin, archaeologists uncovered the ruins of a whole civilization that thrived centuries before Tikal. Its capital was the city of El Mirador, which reached its peak from around 300 BC to 150 AD. This city was a true metropolis of its time. It was home to the La Danta Pyramid, one of the largest structures by volume ever built in the world, surpassing the Great Pyramid of Giza in this regard. The city was connected by a network of paved roads, known as Sakbe, to dozens of other settlements. It was a complex, highly developed civilization with its own writing, art, and political structure that experienced its own flourishing and collapse long before the start of the classical period. The history of the Maya turned out not to be a one-act play, but a series of waves, cycles of rise and fall that repeated over almost 3,000 years. The myth of a single peak has concealed an entire lost chapter in Maya history, revealing that their ability to rejuvenate was just as remarkable as their achievements during their golden age. And since we are discussing decline and resurgence, it's worth reevaluating our understanding of the end of the most famous empire in history. Myth number 25. Rome, an empire that did not die, but changed its robes. In the year 476, the barbarian leader Odoacer overthrew the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus. This date is memorized by every schoolchild. It is considered one of the greatest turning points in history, marking the end of antiquity and the beginning of the Middle Ages. The fall of Rome. This phrase sounds like a definitive and irreversible verdict. We imagine hordes of wild barbarians burning cities, destroying libraries, and plunging civilization into darkness for 1,000 years. The Roman Empire, a colossal entity that stood for centuries, eventually fell, leaving chaos in its wake. This myth of a sudden and complete disaster is quite dramatic. It draws a clear line between two eras and acts as a cautionary tale on how even the mightiest powers can collapse. We accept this narrative because it presents a straightforward explanation for complex historical processes. However, if we view the events of the 5th century not as an apocalypse, but as a gradual process of transformation, we see a different picture. The idea of a fall is largely a retrospective construct created by historians in later times. For those who lived during that era, nothing fell in a single day. The truth is that the Roman Empire didn't so much fall as it mutated and dissolved, while its specter lived on for many centuries, shaping the contours of the New World. Firstly, in 476, only the Western Roman Empire fell. The Eastern Empire, centered in Constantinople, known as Byzantium, continued to exist and thrive for nearly 1,000 years, preserving Roman law, administrative structures, and the title of emperor. Secondly, even in the West, the concept of an empire did not die. The barbarian kings who seized power in former Roman provinces did not seek to destroy the Roman system. On the contrary, they admired it and tried to emulate it. They continued to use Roman laws, minted coins bearing the likeness of the Eastern emperor, adopted Roman titles, and governed using remnants of Roman administration. They aimed to be not the destroyers of Rome, but its new rulers. Perhaps the most remarkable transformation of the idea of Rome occurred in the religious sphere. The Catholic Church, which survived the collapse of secular power, essentially copied the administrative structure of the empire. Dioceses became church parishes, and the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, inherited not only the city, but also many functions and even the title of emperor. For example, the title of Pontifex Maximus, held by Roman emperors as high priests, passed to the Pope and is still in use today. Latin remained the language of the church, science, and diplomacy for 1,000 years. The myth of the fall of Rome obscures a far more intriguing process, the process of continuity and transformation. The empire did not vanish overnight. Instead, it simply shed its legionnaire armor and donned the cassock of a priest and the mantle of a medieval king. While some ideas outlived their creators, other knowledge was uncovered long before their official discoverer. Myth number 26. Egypt. Hieroglyphs that were read in Baghdad 1,000 years before Champollion. Jean-François Champollion, a brilliant French linguist who, in 1822, after years of effort, finally unlocked the mystery of Egyptian hieroglyphs using the Rosetta Stone. This story is one of the most famous tales in the history of science. It tells how an ancient civilization, silent for nearly 1,500 years, finally spoke again, thanks to the genius of one man. Imagine a time after the closing of the last pagan temples in the 6th century AD, when the key to the hieroglyphs was thought to be completely lost. Throughout the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, European scholars gazed at the mysterious symbols, believing them to be purely symbolic and mystical writing, unrelated to spoken sounds. It was only Champollion's revelation that hieroglyphs could be both phonetic signs and ideograms that broke the silence. This myth of a millennium of silence and a lone deciphering hero flatters the 19th century European science. It paints a picture of total oblivion, followed by a brilliant revival of knowledge credited solely to European intellect. We believe this story because it has become canonized. Champollion is the hero, the Rosetta Stone is the key, and everything that occurred between the decline of ancient Egyptian culture and its rediscovery is a dark void, a complete ignorance. However, if we shift our gaze eastward, from Paris and London to the flourishing scientific centers of the medieval Islamic world, we find that attempts to decipher hieroglyphs never ceased. In fact, some were remarkably successful. Arab scholars and alchemists living in Egypt and the Middle East showed a keen interest in ancient heritage. Unlike Europeans, they had direct access to monuments and possibly to descendants of the Copts, whose language was a direct heir to ancient Egyptian. Some of these scholars came astonishingly close to cracking the code of hieroglyphs. One of the most outstanding was a scholar named Ibn Washia, who lived in the 9th to 10th centuries. In his Treatise on Ancient Alphabets, he dedicated an entire chapter to Egyptian hieroglyphs. Through his study, he reached two revolutionary conclusions that European science would not grasp for another 900 years. First, he realized that many hieroglyphs have phonetic meanings, representing sounds rather than just concepts. Second, he correctly associated many hieroglyphic signs with their Coptic phonetic equivalents. Essentially, he stumbled upon the very key that Champollion would later find, the connection between the dead hieroglyphic script and the living Coptic language. Unfortunately, his work was forgotten and did not gain widespread recognition. Yet, the mere existence of his insights completely dismantles the myth of total oblivion. Knowledge wasn't lost, it merely migrated and was preserved in a different cultural environment. The myth of Champollion, the discoverer, obscures the rich history of medieval Arab science and shows that the path to great discoveries is rarely straight. Often, it is a trail already blazed by others, whose names have been unjustly forgotten. And speaking of forgotten knowledge, it's worth remembering that the ruins of the great Maya cities were never truly lost. Myth number 27. The Maya, lost cities that no one truly lost, jungles that consumed a civilization, vines winding around fallen temples, and the brave Western explorers, adventurous archaeologists like John Lloyd Stevens, who in the 19th century, machetes in hand, forged their way through dense jungles to discover the lost Mayan cities for the world, Copan, Palenque, Uxmal. This image of cities lost in the jungle has become one of the most romantic and enduring myths in archaeology. It paints a picture of total oblivion, as if all knowledge of the ancient capital's locations was erased from human memory after the collapse of the Classic period. Only the heroism and scientific curiosity of Western pioneers allowed these treasures of civilization to be reclaimed. We believe in this myth because it captivates the imagination. It's a tale of adventure, mystery, and great discoveries. It places the Western explorer at the center of the narrative, making him the main hero who saves the legacy of the past from oblivion. But this version of history overlooks one very important fact. These cities were never truly lost, they were just lost to the Western world. The truth is that indigenous peoples, descendants of the Maya who continued to live in these regions, always knew where the ancient cities were. For them, these were not merely ruins, but sacred places, the homes of their ancestors. They didn't dwell in monumental centers because those had ceased to function, but they continued to visit them for rituals, offerings, and to communicate with spirits. Local legends and oral traditions have always preserved the memory of, quote, great stone houses. When Stevens and other explorers, quote, discovered these cities, they weren't blindly wandering through the jungle. They were guided by local Maya guides for whom these places were well known. What was an, quote, discovery for a European was simply a demonstration of what had always existed for the local people. Furthermore, some cities, like Tulum on the coast or Chichen Itza in northern Yucatan, were inhabited or at least actively visited right up until the arrival of the Spaniards, and even afterward. The myth of the lost cities is a product of colonial thinking that denies the indigenous peoples their own history and memory. It ignores the fact that Mayan culture did not die with the cities of the Classic period, but continued to live and evolve, maintaining a connection to its past. The discovery of these cities was less an act of finding something lost than an act of appropriation and renaming, integrating Mayan heritage into the Western scientific paradigm. And since we are discussing distorted perceptions, it is worth reconsidering the role of those traditionally seen as the grave diggers of great civilizations. Myth number 28. Rome. Barbarians who dreamed of becoming Romans. Barbarians at the gates. This image has become synonymous with the end of civilization. We picture scruffy, wild warriors, Goths, Vandals, Huns, storming prosperous Roman cities, spreading death and destruction. They burn villas, shatter statues, and demolish aqueducts. In this worldview, the barbarians represent a blind, irrational force of chaos, the antithesis to Roman order and law. Their sole purpose was to plunder and destroy. According to this myth, they are directly responsible for the fall of the Roman Empire and the onset of the Dark Ages. This idea gained popularity among historians during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, who idealized antiquity and viewed the Germanic tribes merely as destroyers. This myth is simple, understandable, and assigns blame for a great historical drama to specific parties. It creates a clear dichotomy of us versus them, civilization versus savagery. We believe in it because it provides an easy explanation for a complex process of decline, attributing everything to external aggression. However, if we examine the relationship between Rome and the barbarians not as a one-time invasion, but as a centuries-long process of interaction, migration, and acculturation, the image of the barbaric destroyer crumbles. The truth is that the Germanic tribes living on the borders of the empire did not so much wish to destroy Rome as they desperately dreamed of becoming a part of it. Roman civilization was incredibly appealing to them. They wanted Roman gold, Roman goods, Roman weapons, and, most importantly, Roman status. Many of them served for centuries in the Roman army as mercenaries, defending the empire's borders against other, more savage tribes. Their leaders sought to acquire Roman titles such as consul or patrician. When the so-called Great Migrations of the 4th and 5th centuries began, triggered by the pressure of the Huns from the east, the Germans did not march on Rome with the intent to destroy it. They came seeking refuge and land, which they hoped to receive from the emperor in exchange for military service, just as had happened many times before. The problem was that by then, the Roman administrative and military machine had grown too weak and corrupt to handle the influx of migrants. The violence and destruction that certainly occurred were often not the result of blind hatred, but rather the consequences of failed negotiations, unpaid salaries, or breaches of contracts by the Romans. The sacking of Rome by the Goths in 410 or by the Vandals in 455 was not an act of annihilation, but rather a means to pressure the authorities and obtain what they desired. The barbarians did not dismantle the Roman system. They sought to take control of it, trying to preserve its functioning elements, such as taxation and legislation, for their own needs. The myth of the barbarian destroyers obscures a tragic story about how the Roman Empire fell not so much to the blows of enemies as under its own weight, having failed to integrate those who most wanted to be Roman. And while discussing the makeup of empires, it's worth dispelling the myth of the racial homogeneity of another great civilization. Myth number 29. Egypt, the people of the Nile, who were a rainbow, not a single color. Ancient Egyptians. How do we envision them? This question has been the battleground for fierce ideological conflicts for the past 2 centuries. Depending on the political agenda, they have been portrayed as either fair-skinned representatives of a so-called Mediterranean race, or exclusively dark-skinned Africans, the founders of a black civilization. In popular culture, especially in Hollywood movies, the image of Egyptians resembling modern Arabs or Europeans has taken root, leading to rightful accusations of whitewashing. On the other hand, Afrocentric theories sometimes swing to the opposite extreme, denying any external influence. At the center of this debate lies the myth that Egyptians were a monolithic, racially homogeneous group. We attempt to fit them into modern racial categories, arguing over whether they were white or black, while losing sight of the essence of their identity. The truth is that ancient Egypt, throughout its 3,000 years of history, was not a monolithic nation, but a vast melting pot, a crossroads of civilizations where peoples and cultures from Africa, Asia, and the Mediterranean merged. Its identity was cultural, not racial. An Egyptian was someone who spoke the Egyptian language, worshipped Egyptian gods, and followed Egyptian customs regardless of skin color or skull shape. Egypt's geographical position in the Nile Valley, connecting the heart of Africa to the Mediterranean Sea and the Middle East, made it a natural center of migration and trade. From the south, Nubians, modern-day Sudan, who were dark-skinned, arrived, mixing with the Egyptians and, at one point, the 25th dynasty, ruling all of Egypt as pharaohs. From the west, light-skinned tribes from Libya also established their dynasties. From the east, Semitic peoples, the Hyksos, came, seizing the Nile Delta. Later, during the Hellenistic and Roman periods, Greeks, Romans, and other peoples from the empire flooded into Egypt. They all left their mark on the country's gene pool and culture. The Egyptians themselves, in their paintings, clearly distinguished between themselves, Nubians, Asians, and Libyans, depicting them with different skin tones. They most often painted themselves in reddish-brown, men, and yellowish-beige, women, which was an artistic convention rather than an accurate reflection of reality. The myth of racial homogeneity in Egypt obscures its greatest achievement, the creation of a powerful cultural paradigm that could assimilate and unite diverse peoples. To be Egyptian meant to belong to a great civilization, not to a specific race. And while Egypt absorbed the world around it, the Maya civilization showcased an astonishing ability to adapt to changing conditions, dispelling yet another myth of its static nature. Myth number 30. The Maya, a phoenix civilization that continually rose from the ashes. The collapse of the Maya civilization. This phrase paints a picture of a sudden and definitive disappearance. The flourishing cities of the classical period in the southern lowlands, such as Tikal, were abandoned around 900 AD, and afterward, as the popular myth goes, the Maya civilization never recovered. We imagine the survivors scattered throughout the jungles, their vast knowledge lost, and their culture reduced to a primitive state. In this narrative, the history of the Maya is one of a great rise followed by a devastating fall. This myth of a static civilization that reached its peak only to collapse once and for all is convenient. It crafts a simple and dramatic story that easily sticks in our minds. It also explains why, by the time the Spaniards arrived, the Maya were no longer constructing massive pyramids like those found in Tikal. We buy into this myth because it supports the idea of the fragility of complex societies and the irreversibility of historical catastrophes. However, this portrayal overlooks the remarkable resilience and adaptability of Maya culture, which did not disappear, but merely took on new forms and shifted its geography. The truth is that the collapse of the 9th century primarily affected the cities in the southern lowland regions, which faced ecological crises, droughts, and political instability. Yet, this was not the end of civilization. It was a shift of its center. While the southern cities fell into decline, a new flourishing began in the northern Yucatan Peninsula and the mountainous regions of Guatemala. The Maya did not vanish, they adapted. They moved their centers to the coast and drier areas, establishing new and powerful city-states like Chichen Itza, Uxmal, and Mayapan. Their economic model transformed. Instead of relying solely on intensive agriculture in the jungles, maritime trade became central. The Maya built large canoes and created an extensive trade network that spanned the entire Caribbean coast, from Mexico to Honduras. They traded salt, honey, cotton, obsidian, and other goods, becoming the leading seafarers in the region. Their architecture and art evolved, incorporating influences from neighboring cultures like the Toltecs, yet they retained their writing, calendar, and religious beliefs. This post-classic Maya civilization survived for over 600 more years and fiercely resisted the Spanish conquistadors. The myth of a single collapse conceals the truth about the incredible resilience of the Maya, their capacity for transformation and renewal. Their history is not a tale of decline, but a story of a phoenix-like civilization constantly adapting and finding the strength to rise from the ashes of its own crises, proving that the end of one era is always the beginning of another. And so, the archive doors close, but only for a moment. We have passed through the veil of 30 myths, and I hope you have seen that the real story, stripped of propaganda and misconceptions, is always more complex, deeper, and infinitely more fascinating than any legend.